Well, US President Joe Biden had a lot to say about China during his first news conference as Commander-in-Chief. Mr. Biden telling reporters he is not seeking confrontation with Beijing, but he also paints a broader picture of an ongoing global battle, in his words, between the utility of democracies and autocracies. A battle he says China cannot win. Here's more from the US President.
China has an overall goal, and I don't criticize them for the goal, but they have an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch, because the United States is going to continue to grow and expand.
Well, China's ambassador to the US says China is not interested in besting America. Take a listen.
Our goal is to meet the growing aspiration of the Chinese people for a better life. Our goal is not to compete with or replace any other country. This is never our national strategy. Hopefully people could have a better understanding of this.
Well, the ambassador also denied claims of human rights abuses in Xinjiang that have put China increasingly on the defensive. He spoke with our Christian Amanpour after CNN's exclusive reporting on the lost children of Xinjiang, which you saw in this show yesterday. Now, today, Beijing responded to the latest sanctions from the West by slapping its own penalties on British individuals and entities, accusing them of maliciously spreading lies. One of those sanctions says he'll wear it as a badge of honour. Parliament member Ian Duncan-Smith, who will join us later on the show, says it's his government's duty to call out Chinese abuses and genocide of the Uyghurs. Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab says if Beijing really wants to rebut the claims, it should grant the United Nations full access to the region. Well, our international diplomatic editor Nic Robertson is following this story from London for us and joins us now live. Nic, the UK was not alone in imposing sanctions on China for these human rights abuses. The US and the EU did the same. Why then did China retaliate against the UK?
Well, the China's pushed back against all these sanctions from all these countries, but typically in a scenario like this, China is going to try to pick off countries depending on their national interests. And part of the national interest of the UK would be able to have some kind of a trade relationship with China going forward, although, frankly, that does look like it's becoming more difficult. So in the same way that Russia, another autocracy, tries to divide the international resolve against it, to wit, NATO, tries to divide that, China will try to divide the criticism against it because it understands fundamentally, and you heard President Biden there, part of what he said was, you know, right after his inauguration or right after he'd been announced as very clearly president-elect, he'd had a more than 2-hour call with President Xi of China. That he made very clear to the Chinese president that he was going to work, and to the rest of the world, that he was going to work with a coalition of allies and partners around the world to come up with a common position to try to make sure that China abides by the global rules-based system. A part of that is respecting human rights, in particular the Uyghurs. So China's response does seem to be to try to pick off nations individually. If it can say to the UK, we're going to pick on these particular politicians and these particular entities, that will weaken your resolve, rather than try to sort of have a blanket response to the US, to the EU, and to the UK. So I think part of it is to pick off the UK and try and pick off other nations. That's what it will likely do. But also it's an internal message in China as well, of course, to try to portray that this is just, you know, it's not a concerted effort against China. It is a concerted effort by allies to try to reform China's behavior. That's what it is.
And just briefly, Nic, if China is adamant that it has nothing to hide, why won't it let UN investigators in?
The UN investigators, if they were to get access, would undoubtedly want to go to some of those locations that have been identified by satellite photography and have been seen by various governments, including the British government, of an example of what could be going on inside those buildings, as reported by people who've either got families in those buildings or have managed to escape from the region and certainly got first-hand or second-hand accounts of what's going on there. So China knows that there would be a very clear focus of those UN investigators, and it would target these buildings and facilities that have huge question marks over their heads, and many hundreds of thousands of people corralled up inside in difficult conditions, as best we know, undergoing unexplained by the Chinese authorities re-education. So the Chinese government would know that would be the focus, and therefore the international community is led to a simple conclusion that there's something there that the Chinese government doesn't want to see.
All right, Nic Robertson for us in London. Good to have you on this story. Thank you. Well, some Western clothing companies have taken a stand against claims of forced labor in Xinjiang's cotton industry, and now their words are coming back to bite them. H&M, Nike and Burberry are among those facing a huge backlash in the country, in China's state-run media and, of course, on social media. Calls are growing for boycotts, and H&M has been taken off Chinese e-commerce sites. Well, China says the forced labor claims are, quote, completely untrue. So these retailers are under fire in one of the world's largest markets for speaking out and taking a stand against China. CNN's Clare Sebastian is following the story from New York. And Claire, I'm thinking a lot of people probably didn't realize that this particular region in China is responsible for 20% of the world's cotton. So there are a lot of major brands tied up working in that region.
Yes, Lynda, but I think it's important to point out that these statements from these companies that say in many cases that they're very concerned about human rights abuses in that region. Some have said they're going to stop sourcing cotton from there, or that they never did source cotton from there. Those statements came out months ago. So it seems that the trigger for this online backlash and state media backlash was actually the sort of geopolitical backdrop that you were just discussing with Nic, the sanctions that came out earlier this week. It's not new for global corporations to come under fire in China in this way for political reasons, but this is definitely spreading. We see you mentioned H&M, you mentioned Nike, Burberry, the first luxury brand to be embroiled in this, and there's a lot at stake here. H&M has 500 stores in China. This is their second largest amount of stores outside of the US. Burberry in particular, very exposed. Pre-pandemic, about 40% of their sales came from Asia Pacific. So this is why you see these companies treading such a fine line here, saying very little about this, because this is such a huge consumer market for them, and they know that this is the cost of doing business, in some ways navigating these political issues. But with Xinjiang, an issue that the US government has labeled genocide, it's very difficult to not come out and condemn this, and if you don't want to risk backlash outside of China. So it's a really difficult choice for these companies.
Yeah, it certainly is. Clare Sebastian in New York, good to have you on the show. Thanks so much. Well, coming up, we're going to speak to a British human rights lawyer who was just hit with sanctions by the Chinese government. What she says about Beijing's treatment of the minority Uyghurs, coming up next. Plus, the European Union ramps up pressure on AstraZeneca for falling short on COVID vaccine deliveries. We'll tell you about the tense EU leaders summit. Stay with us.